I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Kayla Holzhauer, and I'm a student at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. I just completed my second year in the architecture program. This research project focuses on creativity and business versus design, asking the question, who is more creative, business students in the Carlson School of Management or design students in the College of Design? I would like to thank Professor Brad Hokanson, my faculty mentor, and the University of Minnesota Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program for providing me with the resources and guidance to complete this project. The procedure for the project consisted of three distinct parts. The first was a survey that collected some demographic information for each student who took the survey. So those questions related to the student's college and major, their age, any minors they were pursuing, and whether or not they had received any creative training in the past. The second portion was based off of the Torrance creativity test, which is the standardized creativity test, and it asked students to identify uses for an everyday object in 90 seconds. So these objects were randomized and ranged from a cardboard box to a deck of cards to a pencil. And the final portion of the test asked students to rank themselves on a scale when provided with a statement that related to their creative tendencies. This was an example statement. I look for different ways to understand a problem. So it didn't explicitly mention their creativity or creative abilities, but related to students' ability to solve problems creatively. They were asked to rank themselves on the scale from almost never to most of the time, which I then converted to a numerical scale from 1 to 5. The final question in this portion asked students very explicitly if they consider themselves creative. Those responses range from not really to yes generally, and were converted to a numerical score from 1 to 4. So the big question, who's more creative? And in short, that would be the CETA students, and this is based on the second portion of the test where they were asked to identify uses for the everyday object. The average number of responses was 7.8. CETA students were slightly higher with 8.1 responses, and some students, the Carlson students, were just below at 7.2. Now, looking at their creativity scores, so these were the average of all those numerical scores that these students ranked themselves with those statements that I mentioned before. The average was a 3.5, so that was just over considering themselves to do that particular creative thing most of the time. CETA students were even higher above that at 3.7. CSAM students were slightly lower at 3.3. Now, the interesting thing is who thinks they're more creative. So that was that last question on the third portion of the test, where they were asked to rank themselves on the scale from 1 to 4. The average being a 3, so that was most of the time thinking that they were creative. CETA students were a little higher at 3.4, and CSAM students were significantly lower at a 2.5. So a 2.5 was not really considering themselves creative. Now, those responses became more interesting when I decided to create a ratio of those two responses to kind of create like a perception to reality ratio. So that would be the perception of their creativity to their actual creative ranking. CETA students were at a 0.9, which would be almost 1, meaning that they knew exactly how creative they were. CSAM students were lower, meaning that they thought they were less creative than they actually were. That's interesting because some students were already less creative, but then they thought they were even less creative than they were. So I found after looking at all the different responses for each portion of the survey that creativity did differ a little bit. CETA students scored themselves highest in situations that involved combining ideas. So those were scenarios where they were where you were looking at two different ideas and finding that intersection or combining different ideas to solve a problem. See, some students scored highest on creative skills related to problem solving. So those were your really basic, like I use problem solving to when looking at a problem. And the Carlson students scored the lowest in categories related to others' perceptions of their creative abilities. So those questions that asked if other people think they're creative or think that they come up with new ideas, that sort of thing, they actually scored themselves lower. So those business students didn't think people saw them as creative. So there were a couple of things that made a difference with the scores across the board. Both the design students and the business students with minors came up with an average of 2 more responses than students without a minor. So that was on the second portion where they were asked to come up with ideas for an everyday object. Those with minors came up with about 2 more than everyone else. And the Carlson students who had some form of prior creative training came up with more answers and were generally more creative than the CETA's average. So this one's really interesting because the design students were already scoring higher than the Carlson students, but the Carlson students who had kind of dipped their feet in the water with some creative training were actually scoring higher than those students who are getting creative training every day. So then the conclusion, as much as we'd like to have answers, actually tends to bring up some more questions. So these were some of the questions that I thought about as I was summarizing this project. The first is, what can we do to make people think differently, to come up with new ideas? How can classes be taught to make all students more creative? So not just design students, but business students and engineering students and those that we don't necessarily think of as creative majors because everyone needs some creativity. Is the business world underutilizing creativity? I think we know that creative thinking and problem solving is useful um, everywhere, but it seems that maybe those business classes aren't targeting those abilities in the same way. And the fourth, how can we push ourselves to think about problems creatively? So that's kind of the challenge for all of us.